Goodbye, Mr. Resisting Nomad. In contrast to Critchley, Tony Negri is the most representative version of the heroic attempt to stick to fundamental Marxist coordinates and to demonstrate how the very postmodern turn of capitalism, the rise of the post-industrial society with its shift towards informational work, creates the conditions for revolutionizing society even more radically than Marx imagined it, opening up the possibility of absolute democracy. Negri's starting point is a rather standard one. Today, immaterial cognitive work plays the key role in creating new value, and since these cognitive aspects of work predominate, one can no longer measure value with time, labor time. So, the Marxist notion of exploitation is no longer operative. Now, it has to be noted immediately that today there is no production of value, if not immaterial value, which is carried out by free brains capable of innovation. Freedom is the only value that doesn't simply reproduce wealth, but that puts it into circulation. Today's basic productive force is thus the cognitariat, the multitude of cognitive workers. Their work produces freedom, and their freedom is productive. Freedom is the fixed capital that is inside the brain of the people. This, then, is our situation. The subaltern classes are already classes with a fixed capital richer than that of the bosses, a spiritual patrimony more important than what the others boast, and an absolute weapon, the knowledge essential for the reproduction of the world. Instead, today, when the general intellect becomes hegemonic in capitalist production, when, that is, immaterial and cognitive labor become immediately productive, intellectual labor power now frees itself from this relation of subjection, and the productive subject appropriates for itself those labor instruments that capital preconstituted before. We can say that variable capital represents itself as fixed capital. I am productive outside of my relation with capital, and the flow of cognitive and social capital no longer has anything to do with capital as a physical structure in the hands of the bosses. The idea is thus that, with the hegemonic role of the general intellect, capital loses its function of socially organizing production, of bringing together fixed and variable capital, the means of production, and the labor force. Its function is now purely parasitic, which is why it finally becomes possible to lop it off. It is no longer even a question of a violent cut into the social texture, since production and social life itself are progressively organized. The multitude has simply to pursue its work of self-organization, and capital will all of a sudden notice that it is suspended in the air and will crash down, like the cartoon cat walking in the air above a precipice and falling into the abyss beneath its feet when it looks down and notices that the ground is no longer there. The key category here is that of the formal and real subsumption of production under capital. In clear contrast to the evolutionary logic of the changes in relations of production following the development of the means of production, Marx emphasizes how formal subsumption precedes the real form. Capitalists first only formally subsume the production process to their rule, providing raw materials and buying the product from individual artisans who continue to produce the way they did before the subsumption. It is only afterwards that the subsumption becomes material. That is, that the means and organization of production are directly formed by capital, the introduction of machinery, the factory division of labor, Fordism, and so on. This process reaches its culmination in large-scale mechanized factory production, in which the subordination of the worker to capital is directly reproduced in the very material organization of the production process. The worker is materially reduced to a cog in the machine, performing a particular task, with no overview of the entire production process, and no idea of the scientific knowledge that sustains it. Both knowledge and organization are on the side of capital. Here is Marx's description from the Grundrisse. The accumulation of knowledge and of skill, of the general productive forces of the social brain, is thus absorbed into capital, as opposed to labor, and hence appears as an attribute of capital, and more specifically of fixed capital, insofar as it enters into the production process as a means of production proper. Machinery appears, then, as the most adequate form of fixed capital, and fixed capital, insofar as capital's relations with itself are concerned, appears as the most adequate form of capital as such. However, with the post-Fordist shift to the hegemonic role of cognitive labor, knowledge and organization are again reappropriated by the collective of workers, so that, in a kind of negation of the negation, capital once again subsumes production in a purely formal way. Its role is more and more purely parasitic, trying to control and regulate a process fully able to run itself. The problem with Negri and Hardt here is that they are too Marxist, taking over the underlying Marxist schema of historical progress. Like Marx, they celebrate the deterritorializing revolutionary potential of capitalism. Like Marx, they locate the contradiction within capitalism in the gap between this potential and the form of capital, of the private property appropriation of the surplus. In short, they rehabilitate the old Marxist notion of the tension between productive forces and the relations of production. Capitalism already generates the germs of the future new forms of life. It incessantly produces the new commons, so that in a revolutionary explosion, this new is simply to be liberated from the old social form. Here, they remain Deleuzian. When Deleuze and Guattari wrote in Anti-Oedipus that by striving to reach the furthest limit of deterritorialization, a schizophrenic seeks out the very limit of capitalism, he is its inherent tendency brought to fulfillment. Do they thereby not confirm that their own socio-political project is a desperate attempt to realize capitalism's own inherent fantasy, its virtual coordinates? Is communism thereby not reduced to what none other than Bill Gates called frictionless capitalism? Capitalism elevated and intensified to the infinite speed of circulation. No wonder that Negri had recently praised postmodern digital capitalism, claiming that it is already communist and that it needs just a little push, a formal gesture, to openly become such. The basic strategy of contemporary capital is to cover up its superfluousness by finding new ways to once again subsume the free productive multitude. If fixed capital is now singularly capable of imagination, in order to put it to work, there is the need of a new machine. This is the paradoxical communism of capital, the attempt to close, by means of financialization, the global machine of production above and beyond the productive singularities that compose it. It is the attempt to subsume the multitude. There is a feature of this account which cannot but strike the eye. According to philosophical common sense, when one neglects philosophical reflection, the result is that one finds oneself relying on the worst and most naive philosophical framework. Mutatis mutandis, the same rule holds for ferocious anti-Hegelians. It is as if the revenge for their total rejection of Hegel is that they unknowingly use the most superficial Hegelian categories. This accounts for a detail which effectively functions as a symptom of Negri's work. His unconstrained and unreflexive, one is almost tempted to say wild, in the sense of wild psychoanalysis, use of Hegelian categories, which so blatantly contradicts his professed anti-Hegelianism. For example, the contemporary multitude is in itself, but not for itself, and the transition isn't easy. It is an alternation of moments, of taking conscience of some and not of others, of a totality of transitions, interruptions of tendencies and of drifts. Is this not a strange reliance on the Hegelian couplet of the in itself and the for itself? Should, then, we be surprised that when, in their empire, Negri and Hardt refer to Bartleby as the figure of resistance, of the no to the existing universe of social machinery, they interpret Bartleby's I would prefer not to as merely the first move of, as it were, clearing the decks, of acquiring a distance towards the existing social universe. What is then needed is a move towards the long-term work of constructing a new community. If we remain stuck at the Bartleby stage, we end up in a suicidal marginal position with no consequences. In short, for them, Bartleby's I would prefer not to is a Hegelian abstract negation, which should then be overcome by the patient positive work of the determinate negation of the existing social universe. The pointedness of this Hegelian formulation is intentional. Negri and Hardt, the two great anti-Hegelians, make, apropos Bartleby, the most standard, pseudo-Hegelian critical point. The irony is that Negri refers here to the process which the ideologists of contemporary postmodern capitalism themselves celebrate as the passage from material to symbolic production, from the centralist hierarchical logic to the logic of autopoietic self-organization, multi-centered cooperation, and so forth. Negri is here indeed faithful to Marx. What he tries to prove is that Marx was right, that the rise of the general intellect is, in the long term, incompatible with capitalism. The ideologists of postmodern capitalism make the exactly opposite claim. It is Marx's theory and practice which remains within the constraints of hierarchical, centralized state control logic, and thus cannot cope with the social effects of the new informational revolution. There are good empirical reasons for this claim. Again, the supreme irony of history is that the disintegration of communism is the most convincing example of the validity of the traditional Marxist dialectic of forces and relations of production, a dialectic on which Marxism counted in its endeavor to overcome capitalism. What indeed ruined the communist regimes was their inability to accommodate the new social logic sustained by the informational revolution. They tried to steer this revolution as yet another large-scale, centralized state planning project. The paradox is thus that what Negri celebrates as the unique chance for overcoming capitalism, the ideologists of informational revolution eulogize as the rise of the new frictionless capitalism. Who, then, is right here? What is the role of capital in informational society? Negri's basic reference, the famous passage about the general intellect from Marx's Grundrisse, is worth quoting in extenso. In it, Marx deploys a logic of the self-overcoming of capitalism, which he totally abstracts from the active revolutionary struggle. It is formulated in purely economic terms. Capitalism itself is the moving contradiction, in that it presses to reduce labor time to a minimum, while it posits labor time, on the other side, as sole measure and source of wealth. The contradiction, which will ruin capitalism, is thus the contradiction between the capitalist exploitation, which relies on labor time as the sole source of value, and thus the sole source of surplus value, and the scientific technological progress which leads to quantitative and qualitative reduction of the role of direct labor. This labor is reduced both quantitatively to a smaller proportion and qualitatively, as an, of course, indispensable but subordinate moment, compared to general scientific labor, technological application of natural sciences on one side, and to the general productive force arising from social combination, Gleiderung, in total production on the other side, a combination which appears as a natural fruit of social labor, although it is a historic product. Capital thus works towards its own dissolution as the form dominating production. To the degree that large industry develops, the creation of real wealth comes to depend less on labor time and on the amount of labor employed than on the power of the agency set in motion during labor time, whose powerful effectiveness is itself in turn out of all proportion to the direct labor time spent on their production, but depends rather on the general state of science and on the progress of technology, or the application of this science to production. Marx's vision is here that of a fully automated production process, in which the human being, the worker, comes to relate more as watchman and regulator to the production process itself. No longer does the worker insert a modified natural thing, Naturgegenstand, as middle link between the object, and himself. Rather, he inserts the process of nature, transformed into an industrial process, as a means between himself and inorganic nature, mastering it. He steps to the side of the production process instead of being its chief actor. In this transformation, it is neither the direct human labor he himself performs, nor the time during which he works, but rather the appropriation of his own general productive power, his understanding of nature, and his mastery over it by virtue of his presence as a social body. It is, in a word, the development of the social individual which appears as the great foundation stone of production and of wealth. The theft of alien labor time, on which the present wealth is based, appears a miserable foundation in face of this new one, created by large-scale industry itself. As soon as labor, in the direct form, has ceased to be the great wellspring of wealth, labor time ceases and must cease to be its measure. Crucial is here the radical transformation of the status of fixed capital. The development of fixed capital indicates to what degree general social knowledge has become a direct force of production, and to what degree, hence, the conditions of the process of social life itself have come under the control of the general intellect and been transformed in accordance with it. To what degree the powers of social production have been produced, not only in the form of knowledge, but also as immediate organs of social practice, of the real life process. What this means is that, with the development of general social knowledge, the productive power of labor is itself the greatest productive power. From the standpoint of the direct production process, it can be regarded as the production of fixed capital, this fixed capital being man himself. And again, since capital organizes its exploitation by appearing as fixed capital against living labor, the moment the key component of fixed capital is man himself, its general social knowledge, the very social foundation of capitalist exploitation is undermined, and the role of capital becomes purely parasitic. Today, capital can no longer exploit the worker. It can only exploit cooperation amongst workers, amongst laborers. Today, capital has no longer that internal function for which it became the soul of common labor, which produced that abstraction within which progress was made. Today, capital is parasitical because it is no longer inside. It is outside of the creative capacity of the multitude. Negri's idea is that this immaterial labor opens up the possibility of absolute democracy. It cannot be enslaved because it is immediately, in itself, the form and practice of social freedom. In it, form and content coincide. It is immediately free, inventive, creative, an expression of the subject's productivity, active, not reactive, and socialized, always participating in common, cooperative in its very content. This is why it renders capital parasitical, since it is directly socialized. It no longer needs capital to confer on it the form of universality. Exploitation is today essentially the capitalist expropriation of the cooperative power that the singularities of cognitive labor deploy in the social process. It isn't capital anymore that organizes labor, but labor that organizes itself in itself. This notion of the direct productivity of social life itself leads Negri to assert biopolitics in manner different from Agamben. Biopolitics means that human life itself is the direct topic and product of collective labor. It is precisely this directly biopolitical character of production which enables absolute democracy. Biopolitical power, potenza, is therefore contrasted to biopower. As we have noted, is this gesture of Negri not the last in the long Marxist series of identifications of a moment in the social relations of production and/or of technology itself, as the moment that capitalism will no longer be able to integrate, and consequently, which will, in the long term, lead to its demise? For Negri, what is new in the postmodern capitalism of today is the very direct overlapping of the two dimensions, material production and its social form. New social relations are the essence and goal of production. In other words, production is increasingly directly socialized in its very content, which is why it no longer needs the social form of capital imposed onto it. Negri passes all too quickly over the fact that what characterizes our time is biocapitalism, which, in the narrower sense, designates the immense field of new capitalist investments into the direct production of new forms of biological life, from genetically modified crops to the human genome. Surely the first task of the Marxist approach here should be to redefine in more stringent terms the notion of the exploitation of intellectual labor. In what precise theoretical sense is, say, Bill Gates exploiting thousands of programmers who work for him if his exploitation is no longer the theft of alien labor time? Is his role really purely parasitical upon the self-organization of the programmers? Does his capital not, in a more substantial way, provide the very social space for their cooperation? And in what precise sense is the intellectual labor the source of value, if the ultimate measure of value is no longer time? Is the category of value still applicable here? Negri's thesis, reduced to its core, is thus that, with the development of cyber technologies, the primary means of production and profit is no longer the exploitation of labor, but the harvesting of information. With this shift, it becomes possible to liberate labor from within the limits of capitalist production, since the exchange of harvested information on the market no longer relies on the exploitation of labor, that is, on the appropriation of surplus value. The current problem of political economy is to consider human beings when they live and not only when they work, as human beings are always producers. Always, that is, in any moment of life. How is the exploitation of life thinkable? It is not. With today's global interactive media, creative inventiveness is no longer individual, it is immediately collectivized, part of the commons. So any attempt to privatize it through copywriting is problematic. More and more literally. Property is theft here. So what about a company like Microsoft, which does precisely this, organizing and exploiting the collective synergy of creative cognitive singularities? The only remaining task is thus to conceive of how cognitive workers will be able to blow the bosses away because the industrial command of cognitive labor is completely dépassé. What new social movements signal is that the epoch of wage labor is finished, and that the struggle has moved from the level of a fight between labor and capital regarding the wage to a fight between the multitude and the state around the citizen's income. Therein resides the basic feature of today's social revolutionary transition. There is the need to make capital aware of the common good, and if it doesn't want to understand it, it is necessary to impose it. Note Negri's precise formulation, not abolish capital, but compel it to recognize the common good. One remains, thus, within capitalism. From this brief description, one can see the proximity as well as the difference between Marx and Negri. What is not in Marx, what Negri projects onto Marx's general intellect, is his own central notion of biopolitics, as the direct production of life itself in its social dimension. Where Negri sees a direct fusion with cognitive work, the ultimate objects of production are social relations themselves, Marx posits a radical gap, the exclusion of the worker from the production process. Marx envisages a fully automated production process in which the worker steps to one side and is reduced to its watchman and regulator. What this unequivocally means is that the underlying logic is here that of the cunning of reason. Instead of engaging himself directly in the production process, man steps aside and lets nature work upon itself. That is, when he no longer uses tools to work on the objects he wants to transform. When, instead, he inserts the process of nature, transformed into an industrial process, as a means between himself and inorganic nature, mastering it. He turns into a wise manipulator, regulating the production process from a safe distance. Marx's systematic use of the singular, man, the worker, is a key indicator of how the general intellect is not intersubjective, it is monological. This is why, in the Marxian vision, the objects of the production process are precisely not social relations themselves. The administration of things, control of and domination over nature, is here separated from the relations between people. It constitutes a domain of the admiration of things, which no longer has to rely on the domination over people. From a postmodern view, it would be tempting to read this discrepancy between Marx and Negri as an indication of how Marx remains stuck in the old paradigm of centralized instrumental reason, which controls and regulates the production process from the outside. However, there is also a moment of truth in Marx's description, which is obfuscated by Negri, the remaining radical duality of the production process. Today, this duality has acquired a form which was not envisaged by Marx. The kingdom of freedom, the domain of cognitive work, and the kingdom of necessity, the domain of material production, are physically separated, often even by state borders. On the one side are the postmodern companies that exemplify Negri's criteria, free communities of expressive multitudes, which immediately produce life forms, and so on. On the other side, there is the material production process, where full automation is far from achieved, so that we have, often literally on the other side of the world, sweatshops with a strict Fordist organization of labor, where thousands assemble computers and toys, pick bananas or coffee beans, mine for coal or diamonds, and so forth. There is no teleology here, no prospect of sweatshops becoming gradually integrated into the free space of cognitive work. Outsourcing being more rule than exception, the two sides do not even directly relate to each other. They are brought together, mediated, precisely by capital. For each side, the opposite side appears as capital. For the crowds in the sweatshops, capital is the power which, on behalf of cognitive work, employs them to materialize its results. For the cognitive workers, capital is the power which employs them in order to use their results as the blueprints for material production. It is because of this duality, neglected by Negri, that capital is not yet purely parasitic, but still plays a key role in the organization of production. It brings the two sides together.